Between the hills, the stars, the sky, the river so clear, river so clear.
Direct experiences of transcending mystery and wonder are primary sources of Unitarian Universalist inspiration. These experiences open our hearts, renew our spirits, and transform our lives. We draw upon and are inspired by sacred, secular, and scientific understandings that help us make meaning and live into our values. These sources ground us and sustain us in ordinary, difficult, and joyous times. We respect the histories, contexts, and cultures in which these sources were created and are currently practiced. Grateful for the experiences that move us, aware of the religious ancestries we inherit, and enlivened by the diversity which enriches our faith, we are called to ever deepen and expand our wisdom.
But part of what we're doing today is we're going to be talking about our shared values. This is part 2. Back in October, and Mary will summarize this, we talked a little bit about this, but it's the Article 2 revisions, which I've been resisting learning and talking about this because Article 2 revision sounds so boring that I just had zero interest in it. And I thought, why would I want to talk about wonky procedural stuff? But that's not what we're talking about here. We're actually talking about our shared values, which is really pretty fascinating.
In our congregation, every Sunday, someone from this pulpit usually says that as UUs, we are guided by our 7 principles and that they are printed on the back of your order of service. What you may not know is that these core faith statements are housed inside the UUA bylaws. So the Unitarian Universalist Association has bylaws, which is what the association uses to govern itself. And it enumerates 7 principles and also 6 sources, which at one point in the not too distant past were also printed on our order of service. And another thing to point out is that the Unitarian Universalism is a living tradition. And as such, it is required by the bylaws themselves that the section that we review as an association, review and consider revising our principles and sources every 15 years. Now, these might be very familiar to you because actually they date back, the current set dates back to 1985. So the association's a little past due in revising them. And in this time, people have, become very accustomed to them, and some people, and maybe attached. And so this revision is a big deal, as Marnie had sort of alluded to. But a reminder, one of the things that I focused on last time was that the 1985 principles were not the one and only first and always principles. They were themselves revisioned and recast the first set of principles and sources, which were built when the two foundations of Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America joined in 1961. So we had a 1961 set, and then in 1985, and then in 2020, the board of the UUA commissioned a study commission to explore and express anew who and how we are UU now in our era.
So we wanted to make sure you had context today, because one thing I'm really happy, there's new faces and there's people who are very familiar with this tradition here. And I think that's wonderful, because we're really just going to dig in and talk a little bit about what Unitarian Universalism is and what we're grounded in and how that's changing and evolving. And that's what I'm most excited about, is the evolution. I think Mary said it so well. To be part of a living tradition is really exciting, because as we say, so many of us come from so many different walks of life. And if we come from a different kind of religious background, often those are not living traditions. Those are traditions that are not changing and evolving and growing. And I think that's one of the things that makes us unique and continually relevant. And I'm a big fan, especially I know I shared this anecdote a few weeks ago, but as a mother whose children are adults now and young adults, to see your children become the best of you and the best of the things that they've got, and maybe some of the things you don't love, but it is evolution. It is a change that means that they'll survive. It's a survival technique. And I think when you think about religion in America today, to be relevant and to remain, we must evolve and change and transition. So that's really what we're talking about today. What is about the UU principles currently, if you have any familiarity, even if you've just glanced them over, what is meaningful or important or jumps out to you? Just shout out a word. Mary's gonna help me take a note. Acceptance, respect, inclusivity, justice, equity, and compassion, truth. There isn't much to argue with any of those. And if you go to the next slide, as this commission did this work of figuring out what comes next, how to take what we are grounded in since 1985, which is a long time, and ensure that it is relevant, they didn't throw away the past. I think that that's a really important thing to note. They looked at these things and really, really delved in. There is nothing worse as a writer that I can think of than writing by committee. And this committee was a committee of thousands, really. So I think that that's something really important to note too. This study happened, there's a group, but they went out and asked other congregations, looked at different sources, did so much work in this. And so I think that's really interesting. And the one thing I appreciate is there was some groundedness in what exists. So the words that are highlighted here, we'll see as we go through each of these values, you'll see them again and they'll be compared. Now, I want to prepare you for what comes next because it's the thing that they do not recommend you do as a speaker, but I'm doing it for a reason. We're going to walk through the new values and I'm going to read them out loud to you as we go by them. And I know that's not ideal, but I want us to sit in them a little bit. And so if Janelle Cole were here, I would promise her that I will speak slowly. And we will look at them and think about them. And when we get through them at the end, we're going to have a series of questions to talk about. And then we can go back and look at them again. But what I'd like to do is walk through each of these values. You'll see the value, I'll read it. And then the next slide will be the source from which it comes. So it might be a principle or it might be another source. And I didn't include all of the sources. Earlier, we sent out some things to read, and you can see all the sources that each value came from, and they're worth looking at. It's really interesting to see what those sources are, but I tried to just minimize this so we could have a captured conversation. And so we'll walk through them. So I love when there's action, and I think that when we talk about the proposed values and covenant, a covenant is really our promise to action, and you'll see that a lot in here. So if you look at this covenant, we agree, we will, congregation to congregation and through our association. So our congregation, other congregation will support and assist one another in our ministries. We will draw from our heritage of freedom, reason, hope, and courage, building on the foundation of love. One of the notes that I had in here, there's a letter from the commission, and they talk about how sometimes it's hard to describe what Unitarian Universalism is when people ask. You can say it's our liberal religion, it welcomes everyone. But one of the things that I really appreciated about what they said in there is that we come from a lot of paths, but they're all grounded in love. And I think you'll really see this in this rewrite because love is at the center of everything. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. That simplifies things for me. If I can think about what's the loving thing to do, it makes it a lot easier. And I think it's pretty compelling too for others who have a hard time understanding. But inseparable from one another, these shared values are. Next slide. So I like how they did this because they show how they are inseparable. Everything kind of swirls together. You have love at the center. But today we're going to talk about equity, transformation, pluralism, generosity, justice, and interdependence. And you'll see how each of these are tied into our current 7 principles as well as other sources. So again, I invite you to have questions as we go, but this is the sort of, Marnie's going to read the slides to you part so we can really think of them, but I encourage you to sit with them and think about them. We'll start with equity. Equity. We declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness. We covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities. So this is where I was going to talk to you about how it shows the source. I found this really helpful as I was trying to get my head around what is this evolution? What is this transition from the principles that we have to these values that we hold and share? So for this one, it was pretty simple. If you look at the first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, which I've always appreciated so much because it makes me think about that. And it's a hard one. We've had a lot of conversations here about how to honor the inherent worth and dignity of every person in times as fraught as these, where there's so much anger and so much divisiveness, that's a hard thing, but it's always something to hold. So equity, we declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness. And we covenant, again, there's that action there, to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities. You will see later in here, as a congregation, there was an eighth principle proposed a couple years ago, and Mary, correct me if I misspeak on this one, and we didn't adopt it as a congregation. We didn't object to it. We just didn't have the formal engagement around it that maybe other congregations or larger had. But it does address some of the things about being inclusive and accessible. And so another thing you'll see in these values is those words and that intent is woven throughout them. So if you remember anything about the eighth principle, it'll help you know how that is a continuum in these values as well. Any questions or comments? Okay, next slide. Generosity. I also appreciate how each of these values has a one word. I think that simplifies things as well too. And you're gonna laugh, but I'm like, oh, I could get a necklace and it could just have like generosity on it and it would be speaking to my values. It would be so cute. So, you know, it's a merchandising opportunity too. So generosity. We cultivate a spirit of gratitude and hope. We covenant, we agree, to freely and compassionately share our faith, presence, and resources. Our generosity connects us to one another in relationships of interdependence and mutuality. So again, think about the thought process that went into how you leverage this word generosity, because I think when you think about a faith community and the generousness that you collect, you use time and money and talent, and it is a generous giving of yourself. And then you use that generosity to do good in the world. I think this is a really beautiful way of expressing that, because generosity isn't just to go out there and, you know, be a white savior. It's to connect us with one another in relationships, interdependence and mutuality. So again, it's helping to remind us of that equity of the value before. So if you go to the next slide, again, we talked a little bit about these sources that are tied to this. So interdependence is another value that we'll get to in generosity. Not each value has specifically, it's tied to this principle. It is in a way, and you'll see they mix in here as we go. But there were other sources. And again, I didn't list every single source for every single one of this. This is a much longer PowerPoint slide that I just edited to use for our purposes today. But you can see a source here is Martin Luther King Jr. talking about how all life is interrelated and we are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. And that's the interrelated structure of reality. So this speaks to the interdependence, one of the values, as well as generosity. And so you can see a little bit some of these sources. Interdependence. So the interdependent web of all existence is one of my favorite principles. So I was especially interested in this. We honor the interdependent web of all existence. With reverence for the great web of life and with humility, we acknowledge our place in it. We covenant to protect Earth and all beings from exploitation. We will create and nurture sustainable relationships of care and respect, mutuality and justice. We will work to repair harm and damaged relationships. Now, I'm taking this to apply to beavers. That's what's speaking to me right now. But it can apply to many, many things. And this idea that we are all interconnected, because it's a human, it's talking about humanity, but it's also talking about nature. It's talking about so many things. So if you go to the next slide, it really pulls right from that respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. But it goes into a larger vision of that, I think, which is really helpful. And I like how straightforward it is. It doesn't make you guess. So it's to protect Earth and all beings from exploitation. That's what that says. And so it goes into a little more explicit detail than maybe some of our principles do. And it's a little longer. And I'm sure as the writers, this commission, this feels long to me as a writer, but I know how much input goes into all of these. And so I do feel that every word in there matters, and it really clarifies exactly what you're talking about when you talk about interdependence.
One of the points that I meant to make is that the commission was specifically charged with making things active. And so you'll see the format for every value. It's a word, what the value is, but then it's like, how do we put our faith into action? And so what does each thing call us to do? And so everything is like, we covenant to do something. And so that was like a pretty big, focus of this whole endeavor, this whole revision process. So just something to look at as you're.
A couple months ago, Christine had a talk, or she had a presentation here about the seventh principle, and about isn't there a group, or wasn't there some movement or some concept or some idea of a modification to this, to acknowledging that we are part of a larger whole, and so that interdependent web of existence. It really struck me when she, what she was talking about, and I thought that was a very good suggestion or an idea. I really have been kind of
Is it incorporated here, or it's not incorporated here?
It's not incorporated. It was a modification and an acknowledgement of being, it says the honoring the interdependent web of all existence. And I've always thought that this was focusing more on life than just acknowledging the miracle of just existence. And there is some things in there about covenant to protect Earth. Well, what about all the rest of it? And all being, but even just being part of a larger whole, versus acknowledging that we're in an interdependent web, but that it's not just an interdependent web, but that we are part of a larger whole of creation, of existence, of whatever have you. So is there any of,
I'm just trying to look, because it may be that some of that will rise into the transformation piece when we go through them, Jim. So maybe keep that in mind and see if it does sit somewhere. Pluralism, I think, might be a place where it comes up. But let's look. Let's ask that question at the end. Let's see if that is spoken to. Justice. We work to be diverse, multicultural, beloved communities where all thrive. We covenant, action, remember action, we covenant to dismantle racism and all forms of systemic oppression. We support the use of inclusive democratic processes to make decisions within our congregations, our association, and society at large. The next slide. One thing that I appreciate about this so much is sometimes the world, this is just a personal reflection, it feels so big, it feels so hard to be, how can I fix it? How do I fix it, right? And so I really like how this structures out that we're going to support this use. It gives you a little bit more of, if we can do this here, it will spread to there, and then we will have the tools to do it out in the world as well. So that's one of the things that this value speaks to for me. And if you look, it comes a lot from the proposed eighth principle, which again, if you remember, I said we didn't adopt that formally, but it was in the world for several years. Many congregations did, which was journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. So this justice, and of course there are other, it will come up again. I think actually on the next slide, justice comes from many different sources. So I did include a few of those. So it also comes from the different principles, the justice, number 2, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. The goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. So justice is a amalgamation, and I think there's even one more. Yes, number 5, yes. So justice also goes into the 5th principle, which is the use of the democratic process. So you can see that each of these values, again, it's a conglomeration of more than one thing, but these are the sources that it comes back to, this use of democratic process. We covenant to dismantle racism. And if I remember right, in the 8th principle, you know, in that it talks about in the 8th principle, it talks about to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism. Again, as someone who thinks in terms of action, if you're talking about action, when we say we covenant to dismantle racism, we're not putting a bunch of words in between our actions and the goal, the end goal. And I think that's really important when we think about those terms. And I think that was the intent of that 8th principle, but this gives us that more action-oriented form of moving forward.
Could you please explain a little more what exactly a beloved community is?
I think that definition resides within all of us. When they use it in those capital letter beloved community, to me it is the congregation or association or gathering, whatever it is, however you are expressing your Unitarian Universalist faith in community, that's the beloved community when it is sort of within that structure of the UU. Mary, others, are there any others interpreted a different way, especially when it's capitalized like that? This is my beloved community as it relates to UU.
Yeah, part of the, I don't know if I can speak to it, like do it enough justice, but part of that comes from Martin Luther King Jr. talks about the beloved community, and that's our work in the world, is to, like, if we're gonna dismantle racism, the dream is not just like tearing something down, it's creating a beloved community where we treat each other, all of each other, as beloveds.
So we had 2 interpretations of beloved community, and that's okay. It's more than one thing.
Here's a third.
Oh, let's hear it.
Like where you feel at home, that quality of feeling that belonging and acceptance and safety.
So transformation. We adapt to the changing world. We covenant to collectively transform and grow spiritually and ethically. Openness to change is fundamental to our Unitarian and Universalist heritages, never complete and never perfect. This is a big one. This is a pretty heavy thing, and I love that they put into words what we talk about as the living tradition. We must be open to growth and change. We must look at how to transform and grow spiritually and ethically. It's so important. Things aren't the same as when I was born. The things we know and believe, if you look at just how the principles have changed, 1964 to 1985, the world's changed. We use different language. It matters. So that's what transformation is, really putting that we covenant to be open to change, to be willing to change and grow. If you go to the next slide, some of the principles that fuel transformation and also pluralism, which is the next value that we'll explore, is acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. I think that this gets to it in a larger way when we look at transformation, to adapt to the changing world, to know how to, the language we need, who other people are, because I think truths are rising that weren't able to rise before, all of those things. So we're able to transform. Pluralism. We celebrate that we are all sacred beings, diverse in culture, experience, and theology. We covenant to learn from one another in our free and responsible search for truth and meaning. We embrace our differences and commonalities with love, curiosity, and respect. Pluralism, which is not a word that we have seen in our principles, and I'm intrigued by it as a word. I like this definition. I like how they use this. It's a new word in this realm. If you go to the next slide, it really comes from that free and responsible search for truth and meaning. But I love that we celebrate that we're all sacred beings. And I don't know that it gets to your question because but that sacred beings concept is a little bit more a connection to the universe, a connection to the greater whole, to me and to other theologies. And we covenant to learn from one another in our free and responsible search for truth and meaning. My word of the year is curiosity. And so I appreciate this here because one of the things that I've had so much, I've had a lot of anxiety and fear around the world and the way things are and how is it going to turn out and what's going to happen and what if it doesn't happen? And so instead of being afraid, I'm trying to recast that as I'm curious about what will happen next. And this is really helpful in that approach because it's all about curiosity. I'll do what I can and then I'll just try to be curious as to what comes next, and so that I can, be above the line and not descend into despair of anxiety. We've walked through these. We can go back and look at any of them, but I want to take just a few minutes, and I do want to be conscious of time because people's Sundays are sacred to them in a lot of ways. But as you listened to those, as you saw those, as we read through them, what spoke to you? What resonated or perplexed you? What inspired you? And how do they reflect what will keep us relevant as the world moves and changes? Any comments?
One thing I really like, and Mary mentioned it earlier, was how there's actions, concrete actions associated to every value. And our family has a connection to some of the UU churches in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. And one thing we've heard is that there's been throughout the country a kind of movement of white supremacy taking over some UU churches, and the principles had been too vague to kind of preclude that. And so they would get in and kind of use the open-mindedness of the congregation to get in and then take over. And with these actions of dismantling racism, it really stops that in its tracks and allows everyone to go on their own personal journey. So I really enjoy that about the values.
Last slide. Again, just a reminder that at the center of all of these is love. And I think that is a great way to keep them in mind and to know where we come from as a religion, as a faith, and as a community. So we will keep exploring these and talking about these. I don't know, until the timeline, as far as the timeline of when the General Assembly, the larger church will say this is final and good, we'll get more direction. But eventually, the back of our programs will have the values most likely. I don't see this going another direction than forward. So change is with us, and we'll keep talking about this. But I thank you for your attention. Thank you for exploring it with us, and we will continue from here.
And now I will extinguish the chalice with these words from Barbara Hamilton Holloway. Go now in peace. Deeply regard each other. Truly listen to each other. Speak what each must speak. Be ready in every moment to disarm your own heart. Rejoice in this love you have begun.